You guys are not on screen yet. I'll tell you when you guys come on the screen. So the
Students
intro
on
is
air
playing now.
bring
You
together
guys have 15
information,
seconds until I switch over.
organizations, citizens, and their representatives to find common ground on key issues, to deliver better solutions for U.S.
5,
democracy.
4,
Your
3,
voice matters.
2,
On air.
1.
Hello, my name is Camila Anderson. I am a senior majoring in government and international politics at George Mason University. This semester, I'm an intern with Democracy on Air and a fellow with the Global Politics program at George Mason. I will be your host for today's Aircast. Our sponsors this afternoon are Democracy on Air, a nonpartisan nonprofit that supports the U.S. On Air network of 50 governance and election hubs, and students on air at George Mason University, where your voice matters on air. Today, we will be interviewing Heidi Drauschak, who is a candidate from Springfield, Virginia, running for State Senate District 35. Heidi, do you think you could tell us a bit more about yourself? What's your experience with politics, and how did you decide to run for the Senate?
Yeah, sure. Thank you guys so much for having me today. I really appreciate it. Appreciate the chance to get on and speak. So to give a little context, like you said, I am running an SD 35, which is one of the new state Senate districts here in Northern Virginia that makes up Springfield, West Springfield, Annandale, and the surrounding areas, and does include a majority of the GMU campus. I myself, so to give you a little bit of background, I started my career in politics about over a decade ago in federal politics. I worked in the Obama White House and then came to Virginia in 2015 to go to the University of Richmond, where I got my MBA and my law degree. Then got into state politics. Virginia state politics are a wild, wild place to be. It's very small, it's very personal. I fell in love with it because one person can really make a difference. But it unfortunately is kind of the wild, wild west in a lot of ways. We are one of the only states that still has no campaign contribution limits. We have one of the shortest legislative sessions in the country. We unfortunately do things a lot. We still do things, a lot of things today that we did 250 or even 400 years ago. So the deeper I got involved in politics, the more I kind of realized how many systemic reforms we needed to make here in Virginia to make sure that our government was actually representative of the people that it was meant to govern. And so for the last several years, I've worked with nonprofits, with civic organizations, with volunteer organizations to see a lot of these changes and push for a lot of these changes. Unfortunately, in a lot of ways, to no avail. So we've had several years where we've had almost no success on any issues whatsoever. And so this year, well, I made the decision last year, but this year, again, happy to get into it, but with all of the new district lines being drawn and a bunch of new seats being available, I decided to throw my hat in the ring and try and change things from the inside. So that is why I'm running. On a personal note, I live in Springfield with my husband and our dogs and our cat. And I have a son on the way, so he's outside of camera, but I'm about 8 months pregnant. And honestly, a lot of it is to build the community that I want to raise him in. Virginia has made progress on a lot of issues in the past couple of years, but I don't think nearly as much as a lot of us want to see. And so I decided to run and, like I said, hopefully build the community that I want to raise him in. So thanks again for having me.
Thank you. Yeah, that's amazing. Sorry. So I saw on your website that you worked on Democracy Day, an event at the Virginia State Capitol. Do you think you could tell us a little bit more about the event and your involvement with that?
Yeah, happily. So very, very proud of Democracy Day. Like I said, there's a lot of systemic reforms in Virginia. So just to list a couple, so in the state of Virginia, we're one of only 5 states that allows unlimited campaign contributions from anyone, which just means that millions of corporate dollars flood into our state capital and many, many more dollars here than almost anywhere else in the country. We also don't have a personal use ban. So in 48 other states and the federal government, it is illegal for candidates to spend campaign funds on personal matters. but not in Virginia. In Virginia, you can raise as much money as you want and then do anything you want with it. There's also a lot of very exciting reforms. So like ranked choice voting is the perfect example. So anyway, there's this whole slate of issues that I think have been ignored in Virginia and haven't really seen a lot of progress. And so, but one of the things we heard over and over again in our fight for these issues was that legislators would tell us like, well, people aren't really paying attention to this, or people don't really care about these issues. And so what we wanted to do this year was basically speak to that narrative and say, no, that's not true. There are people that care about this. There are people that vote on these issues. And so we organized an in-person lobby day in Richmond, which is the capital, on January 23rd. I hope I have the date right. And we got a ton of people, and we went down to the Capitol in person. We rallied in the morning. We lobbied our legislators. We actually attended the General Assembly. We went to subcommittee and committee hearings and testified. And again, basically just stood up for the first time and said, look, there are a large swath of us that really care about these issues, and you can't keep ignoring them. So I was the lead organizer for the event, was very, very pleased with the outcome, especially given that it was our first year of ever putting on the event. We partnered with over a dozen orgs. So we partnered with groups like Upvote and Fair Vote, who champion ranked choice voting, Big Money Out Virginia, which is a group that I work in that works on campaign finance reform. We had energy groups, we had nonpartisan groups, a bunch of organizations and people kind of all challenging this idea that, the status quo is okay. So yes, very, very proud of the work that we did there, and hopefully the first of many events, although I do hope we actually see some progress on some of these issues so that we don't have to keep lobbying our legislators for some of these common sense reforms.
Wow. Yeah, that sounds really inspiring. And it sounds similar to what some Mason students do as well. I think they go up to the Capitol and do something similar as well. I think Stella actually knows a bit more about that, right, Stella? Stella is one of our student guests. She is also a student at George Mason University and an intern with Democracy on Air this semester.
Yes, hi, Heidi. It's a pleasure to be here. I think Camilla was referring to George Mason students also have a lobby day where student government goes to Richmond to lobby the government for funding and for George Mason's interests in general. You mentioned ranked choice voting briefly in as one of the reforms that is being looked at in Virginia. I was wondering if you could talk more about that.
Yeah, of course. And I will also just say, if you've gone, thank you for lobbying your legislature. Like I said, Virginia, but all state legislatures are very small, and one person talking to your legislature can really make a difference. So anybody listening, or also for the two of you, I really commend that and would say, even if you can just go down for a couple of hours or for a day, it's wonderful when people can actually participate in the legislative process. But moving on to ranked choice voting. So ranked choice voting, the idea, most of you are probably familiar, but just to kind of set the stage, is pretty simple. It basically says, instead of going to your voting place on election day and choosing one candidate or another, ranked choice voting would allow you to rank your choices. And so, if you had 5 candidates on the ballot, instead of choosing one, you would say, okay, my top choice is candidate B, but if B doesn't win, then I'd like C. And if C doesn't win, I'd like E, so on and so forth. The proponents or the argument behind ranked choice voting, and there are a lot, but a couple of the key reasons that I support ranked choice voting, and I think a lot of the advocates for it support it, are that it allows for many more candidates to compete in elections. So right now, third-party candidates, independent candidates, lesser known candidates, minority candidates sometimes can have a really hard time winning elections because people basically say, I don't want to vote for them because it's a throwaway vote. And so they will vote for somebody who they actually prefer a little bit less because they think they're the likely contender. So the argument behind ranked choice voting is that you can vote for who you really want to vote for without jeopardizing, saying like, well, my second choice might lose if I give my vote to this preferred person, because basically what happens is if your preferred candidate gets knocked out of the race, your vote immediately drops down to your second choice. And so then you'd guarantee that, they have your vote. So that I think is the biggest argument. It tends, like I said, to just bring a lot more people into the process, and it allows for a lot more people to step into running for office that otherwise wouldn't actually consider it. It's also one of the other big reasons that I support it is there's a lot of evidence to show that it takes the political polarization out of elections and also some of the negativity. Because as you can imagine, in A versus B race, there's a lot of incentive to kind of go after your opponent and say like, they're terrible, here's all the reasons why, and kind of have a head-to-head race. If you know that you're competing with a bunch of other candidates where you're trying to maybe get the second place spot or the third place spot in a voter's mind, you're much less likely to view it as a head-to-head and much more likely to view it as an election where you say, this is who I am, this is why I'm running, in the hopes that, again, like I said, you may not be somebody's first choice, but they may say, oh, well, I heard about her, I saw him on TV and I kind of liked him, so I'll make him my second or third choice. So there is a lot of evidence to show that it takes a lot of the parts of politics that a lot of us hate out of the system. So anyway, I think there's a lot of really good arguments for it. Opponents of ranked choice voting tend to point out that it just is complicated, but they've done a lot of studies, even with little kids and like Skittles, and say like, rank your favorite candies. And even a kid can understand how this works. It's not overly complicated. But it's scary because it puts a lot of the political process as we know it. It kind of upends it. And so I think there's a lot of people within the system who are very nervous about implementing it because it threatens a lot of the things that we're used to. So despite all that, you're probably seeing and hearing a lot more about it in Virginia. We're seeing it all across the country. States are starting to implement it. Localities are starting to implement it. And so I think there is hope. There is a lot of movement in Virginia to embrace this. How it's going to get embraced is a little bit more complicated. Some advocates want to see it on the presidential level and then kind of trickle down. We also have localities that are now allowed to use it, and then it's kind of like, will it trickle up? So we'll have to see how it gets implemented. But I'm, again, like I said in the beginning, huge proponent, and think it would really change. It's kind of a quick way to change a lot of the parts of our political system that I think a lot of us take issue with.
That's a really great explanation. Thank you so much. Are there any other policies in changing how our elections are run or how democracy works in Virginia or in the US that you would like to tell us about, or any advice on how Virginians can become more engaged politically with our democracy?
Yeah. And you guys are going to get the real policy wonk today. So hopefully you don't mind with these questions. But yes, I would say there's kind of two big buckets. So one, like I mentioned before, getting the corporate influence out of state politics is huge, in my opinion. It's not the sexiest issue. It's sometimes, not the heaviest covered, but Virginia has a real problem we have millions of corporate dollars that flood into elections. They determine outcomes. We have a very dominant corporate lobbying presence. And so I think people rallying around this idea of we want candidates who are committed to not taking corporate funds. So like on my campaign, I'm not taking any corporate money whatsoever. We want legislators who aren't beholden to companies because of those funds. I think demanding that of our legislature is really important because it's something that unfortunately we've kind of, a lot of Virginians kind of say like, well, it's just the way it is, but it doesn't have to be the way that it is. So I think that's one big thing, is just demanding, as especially younger people, that our government is beholden to us, not beholden to other interests, is a really important thing. The other one, this is like super nuanced, but the General Assembly itself. So the General Assembly is our state government. We have a part-time legislature. So our legislature meets for 30 to 60 days at the beginning of each year, and that is pretty much it. As you can imagine, it is very difficult to legislate in that small of a time period. Not to mention, our legislators are all part-time. They, like, for example, the office I'm running for, state senate, it pays $18,000 a year. And so there are a lot of parts of the process that were designed 250 years ago, where landholders would drive their horse and buggy into Richmond and legislate for 30 days and then go home and, farm for 11 months of the year. That doesn't make any sense to me anymore. We have a state with 8 million people. We have the economy the size of a small country. There are very complicated issues that we have to legislate. And I think changing the way that that legislative process works is also something that I would say every Virginian, but especially young people, should put on their radar. Because if you want to have a legislature that you can talk to and you can interact and you can understand, I'm not saying it has to be a full-time legislature, but there has to be more time than 30 days in the beginning of the year. And unfortunately, it just means that like corporate presence gets even stronger because they're pretty much the only people who can afford to play in a 30-day session. So that's kind of another not so typical, but like what I view as like true democracy issue that I personally care very deeply about. But I also think as young people, we need to demand more from our government and say, this needs to be a two-way conversation and we need to be able to participate. But also the government needs to do a better job of letting us know what it's doing. And that can't happen if it happens in 30 days in, the beginning of the year every year.
Yeah, absolutely. And it also to me sounds like a problem of accessibility. I don't know if you could speak more to this, but it definitely seems like running for office isn't very accessible for a lot of people who have to have full-time jobs and can't take like 30, 60 days off of that job, but you're not going to be paid a living wage for an entire year to be in the state legislature.
Correct. Yeah, you nailed it right on the head. It's kind of ironic because when legislators talk about like pay increases, people think like, oh, they're just trying to, get more money for themselves. But with a salary of $18,000, like I said, you nailed it. The reality is almost no like real people can actually apply for that job. Because if you're a teacher or a nurse or, even a mom, like what role is going to allow you to go down to Richmond for 1 month, sometimes 2 months of the year, take off completely, legislate, and then come back? And why would you ever do that for $18,000? And so it's kind of counterintuitive because in some ways, I know anytime a legislator talks about like working more hours or making more money, it feels like this power grab. But ironically, Virginia's system is so backwards that it basically only allows independently wealthy people, retired people, or people who have their own business or a spouse who can support them. And unfortunately, that's a lot of what we see is a lot of retirees, a lot of people who, run their own law firms and can afford to go down to the General Assembly for a month, when really we know the best governments work when everyday people, like I said, teachers, nurses, moms, real people come in and legislate, then we have a more diverse body and you have people who actually know about the problems that they're legislating on. And so, yes, it's, again, I'm not saying every legislator should get paid $250,000 or it needs to be a full-time legislature, but it needs to be a timeline and a salary that allows a school teacher to say, you know what, I think I'm going to go run for House of Delegates and try and represent my area and make change in education. And right now, there's some people in the legislature who do that, who are incredible. But for the average person, it's pretty much impossible.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you for I personally didn't know anything about that issue. I thought that was really informative, and I don't think it's something that a lot of people really think about. On another note, I see you have the pictures of your dogs behind your wall, and it looks like you like to spend a lot of time outside. I personally am very interested in environmental issues, and I was wondering, what is your stance on like climate change and helping communities become more resilient in the face of the threat of climate change.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think realistically, it's going to be probably the issue that defines our generation and like this time period in history. I think it is something that we need to address aggressively. But to your point, it's also something where we are now past the point of mitigating everything. Like, even if we did everything right, we are inevitably going to see some of the effects. And so it's a mix of trying to stop the worst from happening, but also recognizing what has already been done, we have to plan for. And we are going to have to your point, make sure that those communities are taken care of. Virginia, has a coastline that is going to be very heavily affected by this. I think, I don't want to misstate this, but I think we have one of the most affected coastlines as of right now, almost in the country. And so, so all that goes to say, I think Virginia has made good progress on this issue. A couple of years ago, we passed the Virginia Clean Economy Act. We have clean car standards that were based on California standards. We joined RGGI, which is the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which basically joined many other states in basically capping carbon emissions. So there are a lot of big moves that Virginia has made in the last couple of years, and I think has put us on track to be a much greener state. Unfortunately, a lot of it is set in a 2050 timeline. So as somebody who's going to raise a child, when I think about him being 30 before a lot of this is implemented, that's not fast enough. Like, we are going to be dealing with very, very real ramifications by the time that is, that time has come to pass. So I do think, again, we've made progress on the issue. I think as a young person, especially, I'd like to see faster progress, because I think all of us don't want to live in the world that, we're constantly reading about that we could be living in, even in a decade or 2 decades or 3 decades. So I think there's more progress we can do, and we can lean in even harder. The other nice thing is we don't have to necessarily sacrifice to do that. I think a lot of times there's the conversation around the environmental issues is kind of like, oh, well, we all have to like make all these sacrifices to save the world. The funny thing is, especially now that a lot of these technologies are coming about and a lot of them are really, really incredible, you kind of get like everything you want. Like, you can implement green energy, you get higher paying jobs, you get cleaner, a cleaner environment, you get cleaner communities. I mean, historically, the communities that have been hurt the most by things like coal and gas and a lot of these like dirty fuels are unfortunately minority communities, poor communities. So there's basically like, again, I feel like a lot of times the conversation kind of feels like, oh, well, we have to make all these sacrifices, or we can just lean in and, do what we want. The funny thing is, there's now a solution, which is we can embrace a lot of this green energy. We can get a lot more high paying jobs in Virginia. We can create cleaner and safer community. Like, it all kind of goes hand in hand. And I think it's just going to be about embracing that. And part of that is taking the corporate voices that are going to heavily profit off the alternative out of the conversation, because I think that's a lot of what's slowing us down right now. So all of that. And then, like you said, I think a big part of it is unfortunately going to have to be, for the effects that we already are seeing, being realistic about that. And that's everything from coastal flooding to storm, like post mega storm cleanups and things like that. And our infrastructure, that's another big one. Our infrastructure is not built, unfortunately, to weather a lot of these changes. And so one of the things, as we implement a lot of these new technologies, we have to be thinking about, how do we build infrastructure, everything from roads to electrical lines to even just the cars that we choose to drive around, so that we can actually make sure that, what used to be a once in 100-year storm now is maybe once in a decade storm, doesn't wipe out half the state. So I think it's going to be an important conversation. And like I said, possibly the most important conversation of our lifetimes. But it's one that I think has a lot of really good and like solutions if we're just enthusiastic and we kind of lean in.
Thank you. I agree with everything you said, and I really appreciate your very optimistic take and also realistic take on the challenge we face. We do have a question from the YouTube Live from Scott Joy, who asks, how can Mason get a fair percentage of state money, since Mason is a school that is very dependent on the government for funding?
Yeah, so it was funny. I actually spoke to some of your students, or I spoke to some of the GMU students a couple of weeks ago about this, actually, and this was brought to my attention, which is the fact that George Mason gets less funding per student, I think, than any other school in the state. And obviously, as my hopeful future constituents, that's a concern for me. I think realistically, answering how is this going to happen, I think a lot of it is going to be student engagement and telling these stories. A lot, in my experience, a lot of what happens in the state legislature, again, in part because it happens so fast, a lot of times it's not actually people, like I doubt there's people in Richmond who are, actively harboring against GMU. But I do think what realistically happens is that this story isn't being told and it isn't being conveyed to the legislators in our capital. And so I think, as your local representative, it would be my responsibility to tell those stories and bring them to Richmond. But I think one of the most powerful ways to do that is through student stories, is through personal stories, is through, some of the volunteer lobbying that we were talking about. Because a lot of times the Virginia budget that's a whole nother can of worms that I could get into, but it is decided every 2 years. And it's a largely kind of black box process. It happens kind of behind closed doors without a lot of public input. But it has obviously enormous implications because, you add 1 0 and now all of a sudden, your school has all these extra funding for all these different programs. And so I think, again, having a champion who is going to say, I'm going to be there, I'm going to be part of this process, I'm going to make sure that I bring these stories down, I'm going to organize bringing these stories down, and then make sure that the legislators who are making these decisions are very aware of what the scenario is or what the situation is kind of how you start to change that narrative. Because then you have legislators that go in and write the budget and they say, oh yeah, you know what, we realize there's a huge disparity between the schools and we probably should fix that. And so, again, I think that as your local representatives, that's our job to be your voice and then, hopefully do it with you all, but be your voice, especially in the state capitol.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think in the future, hopefully, George Mason students will really appreciate that support from you and, of course, other legislators. Stella, do you have any further questions or?
No, I think I'm good. This was really, really informative, and I would like to thank you so much. I definitely learned a lot about the intricacies of Virginia politics today that I didn't fully realize.
Good. Well, that's like I said, hopefully I didn't go too much into the nuance, but that's my favorite part about all of this. And I will just say as one extra thing, just so everybody's aware, there are no federal elections this year, but there are state elections this year. So for those of you that are registered in Virginia, whether it be in this locality or anywhere across the Commonwealth, it's going to be a huge year for elections. Everything's on the ballot: your state senator, your House of Delegates member, county clerk, school board members, supervisor members. So even though I know it's tempting for all of us to kind of skip this year because it's an off year, for those of you that are interested in this kind of stuff, it just takes a couple of hours out of your year. Get engaged, make sure you're registered to vote, figure out where your polling place is. We will have primaries on June 20th. Early voting starts as early as May 6th. So for those of you that maybe are registered on campus, you can actually vote before you even leave campus. And of course, general elections are in November. So just want to do that plug because, like I said, it will be a very big year and there's going to be very real effects in who gets elected this year. So, like I said, make sure you're registered to vote and know who's on your ballot.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that very important reminder. And thank you so much. I agree with Stella. I learned so much about Virginia politics and things I never even thought about that are just so important to the process. And thank you so much for sharing that with us today.
Yeah, of course. Thanks again for having me.
Great. Still good. Is the Aircast still going, or how do we transition into the?
This week might bring an historic and high-stakes moment. What would be the first
Yeah,
ever
Heidi, if you
indictment of a
need to,
former president.
go take a
Former
break for
President
a
Donald
minute,
Trump says he
definitely.
expects to be arrested
Yeah,
this
we've got
week
8 minutes
on
of
possible
break.
charges from the Manhattan District Attorney related to the Stormy
Right.
Daniels
So,
case.
I mean, maybe in 5 minutes we definitely all need to be back, but I know we've been on the student for a while, like almost an hour. Water.
Perfect. I will
Need anything.
hop off video. I'll be back at 3 o'clock if that's okay.
That sounds perfect.
Of a roadmap for all of this, starting with that local Manhattan case, but the powerful district attorney there, Alvin Bragg. This case centers around $130,000 that was paid to Stephanie Clifford, also known as Stormy Daniels. Allegedly, that was hush money, some say, and that's what the charges would be about if they come, for covering up an affair. Now, two kinds of charges we would be watching for here. One, accounting, bookkeeping, whether Trump and his organization falsely claimed that money was for something else. Two, campaign finance, whether that money was used for a campaign purpose, his reputation. Now, as we're waiting for this indictment, which could come anytime, we've heard from Trump and now more and more leading Republicans, what they're doing and defending him is going on offense against the prosecutor Bragg, saying that he has corrupt bias. Even for us, we cover this all the time. This can be dizzying. So I want to take our viewers through these cases, think of them in terms of location and the types of prosecutors involved. Let's start in Fulton County, Georgia. This is the next case that we expect perhaps in terms of time. This is a local case and for the Fulton County. The question there, did President Trump try to overturn the 2020 results in Georgia? Charges there could include things like election felonies, racketeering. This is the case that we talked about the grand jury meeting on. The grand jury filed its report in this case to the prosecutor there 2 months ago. We're waiting for the prosecutor to make her decision, and that is expected soon. That is the Fulton County, Georgia case. There's a national case that also is incredibly high stakes. The Department of Justice has a special counsel in a separate case that we've been talking about. That special counsel looking into two different kinds of cases, the classified documents that were found at Mar-a-Lago and elsewhere, and then also the 2020 election, whether President Trump had a role. Of course, former President Trump, a candidate for 2024. That's the National Department of Justice case. One more case for all four of them. In terms of, we've got three major potential criminal cases, and we've got one civil case that would really affect former President Trump's business. He is defending himself on all fronts, and we're seeing increasingly Republicans really ratchet up the rhetoric as well.
Well, tell me.
Also, Amna, this is Republican primary ramp-up season. What happens to former President Trump in these cases will very likely affect the Republican primary significantly. Finally, there are security concerns here. I don't have to tell you. We were both there on January 6th, that President Trump has asked for protests over this potential indictment in Manhattan. There is increased security, heightened awareness in New York, and I'm told at the U.S. Capitol, a little bit of awareness, nothing too much yet, but it's already on the radar. People are getting nervous to see what could happen and how supporters of President Trump react.
TikTok has more than 150 million monthly users in the U.S. alone, but faces growing calls for it to be banned over fears about China's access to user data. Laura Barone Lopez looks into the potential personal, political, and international fallout should the U.S. government ban the platform.
One Tuesday morning before work, I was like, let me just upload this video, and then I came home to work and I was like, whoa, it was like 200,000 views, I had all these comments, and from there it just kind of started.
Now with more than 300,000 TikTok followers, D'Alessio runs real-life renovations.
It just seems like you have no control and the government is deciding for you, which is really scary. I'm trying to put on a good face, but that's my business.
Your platform should be banned.
And it's all at risk in Washington.
Mr. Crew, welcome to the most bipartisan committee in Congress. We may not always agree on how to get there, but we care about our national security.
Are you a Chinese company?
Where Democrats and Republicans share a common enemy in TikTok and its CEO, Shou Chew.
This is yet another instance
of TikTok attempting to mislead Americans about what their technology is capable of and who has access to their information.
Chew pushed back, emphasizing TikTok's Project Texas plan, which puts the American company Oracle in control of U.S. data and content.
American data stored on American soil by an American
for this
company,
segment, you guys want me to stay on
by American
and
personnel.
Participate or just
There's
listen?
no public evidence that China has used the platform to spy on Americans.
If
but lawmakers
if you want
weren't
to
convinced.
be done, you can. Or if you just want to if you want to talk about this news with us, you're so welcome to.
We have not provided.
Well, you know what?
I've asked
Okay,
that
cool.
I
Yeah, I'll
find
just let
that
you guys take the lead and
preposterous.
if we've got
TikTok
something to
has
add,
never
I'll add
been
it.
more popular
All right,
or
sounds
problematic. And as was evident in today's hearing, the U.S. believes that TikTok might be pressured by the Chinese government into sharing user data. You, as I understand it, believe this prolonged debate, this 3-year-long debate in Washington about TikTok, has more to do with politics and less to do with privacy. Tell me more about that.
And Cami, are you
Well,
still?
TikTok, like other tech companies, collects a lot of data about users, maybe more than most users understand. And in that way, it does present a danger to privacy.
Yeah, sure.
But
I mean,
there isn't
I'm just,
any good evidence that that
I'm not
danger is
reintroducing
unique
anyone, right?
to
We're
TikTok
just-
as
No,
opposed
I think we're
to
just-
other companies like YouTube, Google
Yeah.
or Meta.
So I'll
What's
just be like,
distinct, of course, is that TikTok
Stella,
has
what
a
did you
Chinese
think
parent
about-
company.
Yeah.
And it seems like a
Yeah,
lot of
absolutely.
politicians are seizing upon that fact to speculate about TikTok presenting a national security threat. Well, it seems like the options on the table are rather severe. One involves forcing a company to sell, and the other is a complete ban on a service that millions of Americans
Stella or
use.
Dilgoon, do you,
And so
either
the
of you have a
third
preference of
option that
who I
TikTok is
ask
presenting, which they've
first
nicknamed
for you?
Project Texas, would keep
I'm fine. I
American
was gonna-
data on American soil.
Yeah, I have things to say.
The whole
so
arrangement
you
is
can-
enforced technically by an American company called
That works.
Oracle. So it does seem like a pretty robust measure in place. Now, I understand it's no
And just so I
complete
know,
guarantee
it's this segment and then we
that
pretty much wrap up, right?
China will
Yeah.
never be able to
Yeah.
access Americans' data,
Cool.
but it does seem to be a compromised position as opposed to a ban or a forced sale.
U.S. values and norms about freedom and security, that China could take the lead.
I have to say that I am more concerned about TikTok's recommendation algorithms than I am about its collection and use of data, especially as compared to other companies. And that's precisely for the reason you just said, right? I mean, the concern I would have is that the algorithms that TikTok uses would surface content that was in favor of the Chinese worldview and dampen criticism. And that's very concerning. So whatever protections are put into place, I would hope that they would have a separate algorithm that is used in the United States that is not
7
beholden to a
seconds.
Chinese
6,
agenda.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Wow, so a lot of developments this past week with Trump's indictment and with the TikTok hearing. Stella, do you have any thoughts on either of those news stories?
Yeah, with the Trump indictment, it's definitely all very interesting. I'm personally trying not to make any predictions. I know there's so much speculation about what's going to happen, but just until the indictments actually go through, I kind of want to wait and see and not necessarily get my hopes up or try to predict the implications because I feel like we really don't know until they actually happen what the exact charges are going to be. It's still kind of speculation. But I am glad that these indictments are finally coming through and that Trump is finally potentially going to be held accountable for a variety of different illegal things throughout the years.
Yeah, and you brought up the point of like us being like unable to predict any implications, but I think I read a news article that talked about what implications it has right now. And obviously the main thing going on in the Republican Party now is like the showdown between former President Trump and Governor DeSantis. I believe I saw something that said the Trump is using these indictments to try to attack DeSantis actually by saying that like, oh, like why aren't you defending me from these attacks, that these false allegations, like to try to take back voters from take back his former voters from the new DeSantis base, trying to show that the DeSantis by not saying anything against these allegations are actually part of the establishment and trying to further divide himself from DeSantis's growing voter base. So I think it has very interesting implications even now, even though we can't predict exactly what's going to happen in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't necessarily feel comfortable predicting whether or not he's going to end up charged. We don't know whether he's going to end up charged. But regardless of whether he is charged or not, he's going to politicize it. I think if he does end up facing like legal consequences of some kind, he definitely will play the victim in the situation and play it off as him being persecuted. And even if he manages to get charges dropped in whatever way, or like ends up getting like not guilty rulings, he will still try to use whatever outcome to his advantage politically against DeSantis, likely against Youngkin if he ends up running for president, and any other Republican challengers.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, no matter what the outcome is, there are going to be political implications on his campaign, for sure.
Right.
Yeah.
And then, I mean, there's nothing in the US Constitution barring a felon from running for president. So, I mean, nothing in the past has stopped Trump from continuing his political career. No amount of scandal has stopped him. So I doubt that, like, even if he were charged, like, I kind of assumed he would continue to push forward with his campaign, kind of regardless of anything. You kind of nodded at that, Heidi. I don't know what your thoughts are, but.
I think you make a very good point. If there's one thing that Trump has done from the very, very beginning of when he first announced, is he is the king of getting out ahead of news and basically drafting the narrative before it even happens, which then, to your point, always makes him the victim. And I think I also agree with you that over and over again, people have made assumptions of like, well, this will stop him. Well, this will stop him. Well, this will slow things down. And I think every time that has proved wrong. So I agree with you. I'm not going to speculate on what exactly is going to happen. I agree with Camilla that this is definitely going to have political implications no matter what happens. But I would not, even if he's held accountable, I would not assume that means that is going to stop anything he was planning on doing. So I think, like you all, I'm very curious to see how all of this plays out. I hope it happens non-violently and also doesn't cause more social or civil unrest, just like nationwide, than needs to happen. But yeah, as somebody who does think that everyone needs to be held accountable, even if you're the president of the United States, I'll be very curious to see how this all pans out.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, we saw how, even after January 6th, how, he still has many supporters after what he's done. So I personally don't think that even if, he is charged, I don't know if that will really like affect his like support base. If anyone has any further thoughts to share, or we can move on to what's going on with TikTok right now in social media. Dogan, do you have any thoughts on that?
To be honest, I personally don't use TikTok. I personally don't really see what the big issue with TikTok is. I think like if they are selling data to back to China, then that is valid grounds to try to ban it in the US. I don't see I personally don't see like what the big deal is, right? Maybe you guys can explain to me.
Yeah, I've used TikTok quite a bit in the past. The algorithm is quite addictive, so I currently don't have TikTok downloaded on my phone. When like the semester starts, I remove it, and then sometimes over break, I'll re-download it. Um, because like I really enjoy the app. I think the app can be a great tool for organizing. It like most social media, I think it's a really mixed bag, right? Like people, because it's a space where lots of different people post ideas, there's both really awesome ideas that are shared there and really harmful ones. And I mean, I really support free speech. I don't it with algorithms and free speech becomes, I think, a slightly more complicated conversation because on the one hand, like, yes, there should be free speech, people should be able to post their ideas, but algorithms promote or suppress different ideas, which is like still in a weird way speech moderation. So if an algorithm is actively promoting like really harmful ideas, like the alt-right pipeline that also develops on TikTok, then I don't really know enough about algorithms, but I know that that makes the conversation a lot more complicated. But in terms of banning it, I mean, I would be sad to see it banned. I definitely think um, there needs to be restrictions on the data that TikTok can collect about users, but as long as um, those like TikTok isn't violating what they say, if the CEO is telling the truth and data isn't being sold to China, I don't think it should be banned. And I definitely agree with, I forget the speaker's name, the in the news aircast, but the expert that was being interviewed who said he was more concerned about the algorithms and how those work versus like TikTok existing at all. I think he's definitely correct. But yeah.
Right. Yeah, those are really good points. And I think we have to remember that it's not just TikTok that has these issues. It's, other social media platforms as well, like Facebook, YouTube, that are pushing these algorithms that are, potentially harmful with these, like the alt-right pipeline that Stella mentioned. And like no one's talking about, banning Facebook entirely. There is that worry that TikTok is giving away data to the Chinese government, which is something that needs to be determined for sure. But yeah, I think there is also a lot of ridicule that I've seen online of state officials interviewing the TikTok CEO because there is that big disconnect between technology and politics, where a lot of these representatives don't know exactly what they're asking and if their questions even make much sense. So I think there is that disconnect, which is also complicating things as well.
Yeah, I also saw those. It's some of the questions that the CEO was being asked in Congress were quite funny. And but also it really shows the like lack of younger people in Congress. And the fact that the people legislating these laws, making these laws about TikTok aren't the users of the app and don't necessarily understand the value of social media. I know in the news clips that we watched, someone was speaking, and his business is based off of TikTok. And it definitely, like, if the app was completely banned in the US, a lot of people's livelihoods would be affected because there's a lot of creators on there who promote their small businesses on there, who are influencers, so they themselves are a business, basically. Like, and even if they have Instagram or YouTube or other platforms, it would still greatly affect them. I know, I guess it made me think of like when Vine shut down and a lot of those um, influencers moved on to other platforms. But I think that was pretty different because it was the app was already losing traction and losing users, and it was a company decision where Vine decided that the company stopped existing. But shutting down a business that is actively thriving and is actively supporting a lot of Americans who it's their job, I think that just shutting it down completely would have so many ramifications.
I find that interesting that like being a creator or an influencer is a legitimate business now because like it's very strange. It's very modern, right? It's probably like came around like the last 10 years probably, right as I was growing up. Like seeing like a guy my age talk about like his business and his business is just just recording himself in a video. Like I find that like very funny because because in my mind like I don't think of that as a real job. Like I don't understand like what value that adds to the economy. Just recording a video and having people watch it, and that is a legitimate business that adds to the economy. I personally don't see how that is like more that on the same level as other people that actually, I don't know, do some like actual like labor, right? And like actually like create something of value that other people can use. I don't think, like creating videos, that is like a usable commodity.
I
What
mean,
are
we're
your thoughts?
creating a video right now, Dalgoon. Like, there's obviously a spectrum of like some people are creators on there and they're doing very valuable things. They're sharing news, they're sharing political opinions, they're spreading awareness. There's a lot of activism. But then, sure, there's people that are sharing makeup or they're sharing their daily life or they're sharing prank videos. And ultimately, like, it doesn't really matter, like, whether or not you think that's like the best use of people's time because like there's so much like quote unquote silly entertainment like reality TV, YouTube videos. Like there's plenty of jobs or in that kind of fall under the entertainment industry that maybe aren't as vital as like teachers or nurses or doctors. Like they're not what's keeping society from completely crumbling, but that doesn't mean that people shouldn't be like paid for their time and their creativity, um or that like the whole app should be taken down for allegations that may or may not be true. Now, yeah, if it is discovered that there definitely is data being given to China and there isn't a way to stop that, I don't really know what should happen then, but that definitely uh, complicates things a lot.
Yeah, I was gonna say I'll pipe in here. I do think the biggest thing is the transparency aspect because I think, like you said, right now there's just a ton of unknowns, and so I think there's an implicit acceptance that people have when they use social media where they just make assumptions where they say like, oh well, this can't be that harmful, or my data, like what are they going to do with my data, because we're basically all implying or like basically signing off to our data being used. But I think for a lot of people, they don't actually understand what that means and what the implications might be. And so, if TikTok asked you at the beginning, and Instagram, for example, just recently I noticed started doing this where they started asking like, do you want your ads like tailored to you? And they of course make it seem really attractive, like having tailored ads is a better thing. But you can now opt out of that and you can be like, nope, I don't want you to tailor ads because inevitably I just end up spending more money and you know a lot more about me. And so I think a lot of this, and I think you guys brought up good points about how it's a broader conversation about social media, because there are so many things that, we know, like, yes, we're talking about foreign interference in this specific case, but we now have data that shows that, people have there's huge mental health implications to social media, especially for young women. Like you said, there's alt-right pipelines, there's political polarization, there's all these implications, but they're kind of quietly baked in a way that it's kind of hard to quantify. And so I think we're going to kind of find out over the next couple of weeks as things come to light over TikTok of like, is there actual foreign interference? Can TikTok hand it, is it a matter of, well, they haven't thus far, or is it that they can't hand it over to the Chinese government? Those are very different conclusions. But I think, again, it's a lot about the legislature, like you mentioned, is kind of, unfortunately, most of the time following these conversations a little late and not really understanding them instead of leading the charge. And I think the more we get these technologies, the more we need to be having the conversation at the front end saying, what are we okay with? What as a society, like, are we okay with the, government being able to track where we're located? I mean, this was a big issue in Virginia this year because the Youngkin administration blocked a bill that would have allowed the or police to track menstrual data for women. And, one can only assume why the government would want access to menstrual data for women. And so then all of a sudden you're like, well, that is pretty serious. I do really care about those implications. And, what you're doing on Instagram may reflect that kind of stuff. So again, I think that all goes to say there's a lot of nuance, but I think we need a lot more transparency. And a lot of the questions you guys are asking, I think, are the right ones, which is like, we need a definitive answer of, is our data being shared? How is it being shared? What are the implications? And then actually like choosing as consumers to buy into that instead of it kind of happening in the background. So I think it's going to be a complicated conversation, but I agree that it's going to have to be all of social media and all of technology. I mean, even like the smart devices that we have in our houses, and can your dishwasher report to the government or to the government, of like, it sounds silly, but like all that kind of comes together. And I don't really think people are using it negatively now, but could they? And that's a question of like, what do we as consumers deserve as protections? So yeah, I think it's going to be complicated, but something the government needs to get ahead of instead of keep chasing behind.
Yeah, I agree, and especially you brought up the point of like giving the customers the choice. I think, to be honest, like thinking about it broadly, I think most people, if they were given the choice to like either like if they knew that their data was being shared or like knew like what people, or like were they given the choice, I think most people actually would not care. I think it's just a conversation that we're having now about like what like we should do with our data. I think most people in the past they just don't care. Like, oh, I have nothing to hide. What are they gonna do with my data? Like, well, okay, like they realize like the government knows that I like watching cat videos. What are they gonna do now, right? These are the conversations that I actually have with most people when I talk about privacy. They most of them don't care, and the people that do care, there's very like little that they can do about it actually. So also like there's that.
The only thing I will say though is we were raised in a time where our government doesn't tend to do much with that. If you go to other countries where people have been jailed because of what they've said on social media, or they've been prosecuted because of messages they had in their DMs, then it suddenly starts to get a lot realer. Like, I agree with you. When you ask most young people, they're like, I don't care, ask me. Like, you can have all my data. What are you going to do with it? But I think in some ways that is because we have been raised in a time where no one has actually done anything with it. If you suddenly started seeing like, oh, well, this influencer just went to jail because they were talking in their private messages and the government didn't like what they were saying about the president, then all of a sudden we might be having a totally different conversation. So I agree with you, but I just want to mention that because I do sometimes think we're so flip about our data, but that's because we live in a very safe, very progressive country where that has never been weaponized against us. But there's a lot of countries in the world where that isn't the case.
Yeah, I think that's also like the reason why a lot of like the difference between like Meta collecting our data and TikTok collecting our data, because China's government functions very differently from our government. So I think it's also a case of the U.S. government being like very greedy with their citizens' data. Like they only want like If it's going to be our citizens' data, it's going to be the U.S. government that takes it, not the Chinese government taking our citizens' data. We're going to monitor our citizens, not you guys. I think that might be a case of that. But I don't know. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I definitely. Heidi earlier brought up like potentially government collecting menstrual cycle data, and I definitely remember when Roe v. Wade was overturned, it made me think more about like privacy and data because I'm already seeing news cases of private messages being subpoenaed and people talking about, well, like, do you need to talk on encrypted messages? And even encrypted messages can still potentially be subpoenaed. So that definitely was a shift of, oh no, like maybe the government's ability to go through our messages is a bad thing. And I definitely, I personally am not super comfortable with the idea that the US government has been going through all of our data. I mean, when like a few years ago when it was like we first learned how much surveillance was happening, I think people were a lot more upset like with Snowden. But then I think it's just become so normalized like over time, and it's maybe like even though I feel like it's normalized too, like half the time when a website asks me if I'm okay with the cookies, I'm like, oh, sure. I don't feel like
That's
clicking
all.
through the stuff because then if I say no, it like is more steps. So I'll just be like, sure, you can have my cookies. But I definitely have also become a lot more flippant with it. But then when I really start to think about it, um, it isn't good, and it isn't like benefiting me. It's benefiting usually companies or the government to have my data, or it's companies are trying to profit off of me through my data. And so there's definitely a normalization that's happened, but that normalization I don't think is benefiting citizens. um and it like might actually be quite insidious the way that like we've gotten so used to the fact that like our privacy shouldn't be that protected.
Well, that's what I was about to say. I think, and as I was mentioning earlier, I think the last, several decades, we've had a relatively peaceful existence, especially here in the United States. And, for a lot of young people, the only thing we've had happen in our life is extra rights being granted to us. Like, oh, now you're allowed to do this. Oh, everything from, the conversation about drug legalization and, even gay marriage within our lifetime. Like, there's a lot of things that it was just kind of like we're getting more and more freedoms. And I think the overturning of Roe v. Wade was the first time for a lot of young people where it was like the government is actively taking something away from you. And I think for a lot of people, it was kind of an eye-opening moment where it was like, ooh, like that didn't feel very good. Like, don't like that. And again, I agree with you. I think there's a normalization of kind of like, what are they going to do? Like, who's going to use my data? Like you said, like if I like cat videos, who cares? But there's a lot of things if somebody does want to start using it that they can do. And I think that's where, again, I don't want to paint a super bleak picture because I do hope that we will get ahead of this conversation. But we don't want to be sitting here 10 or 20 years from now looking back and being like, oops, we got way too comfortable and kind of gave away, we gave away everything. And because we just assumed goodwill, and now we're like actively being taken advantage of. And so, I think again, very complicated, very nuanced. And like you said, a lot of times, like even when they pass reforms, we all accept the cookies anyway, because it's easier to navigate the internet that way. But I think in a lot of ways, that's because we haven't seen the uglier side of a lot of this. And if, like I said, if you talk to advocates and activists in other countries, they would be like, oh, trust me, this can go a very, very negative way if you let it. So yeah, anywho.
Yeah, that's a really crucial insight, especially when apps like TikTok are so addictive to children, and the new generation just growing up with this and getting too comfortable with it is definitely something to think about. And I definitely think digital literacy is something that should be taught to young people a lot more, because I see people my age even like the way we make fun of our like parents and grandparents for believing like Facebook posts as being real when it's just blatant misinformation. Young people buy into that as well. Like we think we're more knowledgeable, but we're really not. And I think it's really important for people to know how to distinguish like, fact from fiction online. And that's going to be really important going forward. But yeah, if anyone has any final thoughts to share.
I thought when you were talking about like, these companies targeting children, like I think there's like a parallel that you can see with the cigarette companies in the 20th century, where we don't know the effects of cigarettes fully, yet these companies, we still allow them to target children and get them addicted. And I think it's very similar with these companies, right? These are very addictive tools that are targeting children, and we don't know what the effects on children's psychology are. The research is still being done, and we don't know a lot yet because research takes a long time, right? And even legislature too. So I think we should be careful on the effects of
Yeah.
social media.
I just saw Utah just passed a law where minors need guardian permission to use social media. And if I was still a minor and lived in Utah, I'm sure I would be upset about that because I definitely enjoyed my access to the internet as a teenager. And I think there's maybe should be oftentimes we think of minors and it's the cutoff of like anyone under 18. And I think there's maybe more nuance that there's a difference between like someone under 12 or under 16 versus like older teenagers still like being put under those same restrictions. And there's definitely also many positive things that people can access on the internet, especially like if someone grows up in a specific worldview, like social media and the internet can be a great way to be exposed to people that are different from you, that are come from different communities, that have different perspectives. And it's a great place for connection. But I also agree with you that like we don't fully know the effect on our brains, the fact and children's brains with the amount of screen time and internet time that we have, and some restrictions probably might be helpful.
Right. There's definitely like that unknown when it comes to, the impact on attention span, mental health, minors having access to, dangerous, violent information online. But dealing with all of those issues takes transparency and information about these apps and these companies, which, gets back into the legislation and the politics of everything, which is something that we should all be keeping an eye on going forward. Thank you, everyone, for sharing your thoughts on on these issues today. It was a really insightful conversation to hear all of your perspectives. Thank you.
Thank you for hosting this.
Dalgoon, you want to stop the aircast? Like to say a few things.
To learn more about the U.S. On-Air Network, go to our national hub at usgov.onair.ca.
That was really neat. Heidi, did you enjoy that?
And select
the
About
that was great.
tab.
Thank you guys for having me. I appreciate
Your
it.
voice
So
matters.
I put a few links in
Subscribe to our
the
YouTube
chat.
channel.
The first one is the Virginia YouTube channel that has a number of previous aircasts with delegates and senators that I think you might find interesting.